This is the late 80s. I was working at a seed and feed store in the northern US. One day, I happened to notice a post on our community bulletin board. It was a job as a caretaker on a nearby farm. This aroused my curiosity, so I called. The job turned out to be temporary, which made it even more alluring. I'd been wanting to move back to Florida for some time now, and the higher pay would make that all possible, and sooner. The number on the posting actually belonged to the owner's children. They needed a caretaker to fill in for their elderly father. He'd had a stroke the month prior, and it was expected that it would take roughly 6 to 9 months, possibly more, for him to fully rehabilitate. In the meantime, he'd be living at a rehab facility. So, they were looking for a single person, or a couple, to live on the farm. There was no crop to plant or harvest, only a pair of horses that required basic care and exercise whenever possible. I provided a brief list of my past jobs and a few handy references. They promised to get back to me soon and hung up. It was almost a week until I heard from them again. They wanted to offer me the job. Naturally, I took it and moved in that same weekend. The place wasn't anything fancy. A modest 3-bedroom home and a couple of large outbuildings built and constructed on 125 acres. My day consisted of mucking out the stalls and providing fresh food and water for the horses. When I finished that, a few times a week, I'd saddle up one and go for a ride around the property. This was all before lunch. After, I'd take care of some little things in need of fixing. If there wasn't any work left, I'd pass out in front of the TV until dinner time. Overall, it was a pretty easy job as far as farm work goes. The owner's kids would call or swing by on occasion, but I had the place to myself, for the most part. I'd been there around 7 months when my prep for lunch was interrupted by a pounding on the door. I answered it and was greeted by a swarm of guys in suits and FBI jackets. They handed me some papers and said that they had a warrant to search the property. I had no idea what to say, so I told them the circumstances and that I had to call the owner's family. They seemed a bit miffed, but understood. I rang the family up, and they told me to let them do their job and stay out of their way. They'd contact their lawyer, and he'd handle it. I said okay, and let them do their thing. They appeared to have been looking for something in particular. The house was left alone. Instead of searching any buildings, a truck with a trailer carrying a backhoe drove toward the back of the property. They passed out of my view, and I returned to making my lunch. Cars came and went for the next few hours. I dozed off in front of the TV later that day, and I was awakened by a ruckus out front. I peeked out the curtains and saw a swarm of news vans and cameras camped on the very front lawn. One of them saw me and shouted, "There he is!" I was still too groggy and had no clue what was going on. A group of reporters and cameras rushed toward the window. I jerked the curtain closed real fast and returned to my post on the couch. I flipped through some channels until I caught sight of the house. What exactly was happening wasn't clear at first. I wiped the sleep from my eyes and turned up the volume. On the screen, an anchor was talking to another guy over the phone while footage of the farm was being shown. The man over the phone mentioned a guy who had disappeared some years prior, a member of the mafia, supposedly. Then, footage switched to a helicopter view of the backfield. A bunch of the same FBI guys and some state officers were standing next to the Bobcat. Next to that, a large hole had been dug. The chopper scanned over from the hole, and we saw two big black bags lying next to one another on the ground. To anyone who's ever seen one, they were obviously body bags, and they looked to have bodies in them. My jaw must have been dragging the floor. I felt drool rolling down my chin and wiped it away. I was freaking out. What the hell have I gotten myself into? I needed some answers, and needed them now. I called the family back and told them exactly what was going on. They said that they were aware, but not to worry about it. I wasn't in any danger, legal or otherwise. I was told to stay in the house and not to talk to the media. They had been notified that I was not involved in any way and should be leaving soon. None of this made me feel any better, but there wasn't much I can do, at least at the moment. I hung up and went back to watching the news coverage. As the hours ground on, the story became more clear. The bodies belonged to two mob guys who had disappeared a few years prior. The scariest part was the revelation. The nice old man who owned the farm was actually a longtime mob associate. The entire mess had me twisted up in knots. I tossed and turned the entire night. I couldn't decide whether to quit or stay on for the remainder. The world of organized crime was foreign to me, and something that I had no desire to be involved in. On the other hand, this was my dream job. I had been treated well, and had seen no sign of any criminal activity. Even as I dialed the phone that morning, I wasn't sure what I would say. However, the moment they answered, my mouth made the choice for me. I said I was calling to let them know I was giving them my 1 week's notice. Any longer was just out of the question. While my time at the farm was wonderful, the recent events were playing on my mind, and very heavily. The owner's daughter was who answered. She tried to talk me out of quitting, but I guess she could tell that I was afraid. She quickly relented and thanked me for doing such a great job. I briefly felt a tinge of guilt, but my brain soon took over. I thanked her and we ended the call. The media had moved on, so I was free to finish my week in peace. The feds must have gotten all they needed that first day. There was no sign of them after that. I rode one of the horses down to the gravesite that next morning, mainly just out of curiosity. The hole had been filled in. Other than some tire tracks, the area looked pretty normal. I don't know what I was expecting. I soon lost interest and returned to the stables. The morning that I moved out, the owner's kid showed up and soon gave me the rest of my payment and said a hearty goodbye. They were going to stay at the house until they found a replacement. I gave them a few recommendations of a few people and provided their numbers. We made some small talk until I'd loaded the last of my things. They wished me luck, and I pulled away. I pointed my truck south toward Florida and arrived a few days later. I've been here ever since. I'd intended on ending it here, but I realized some of you might be wondering what became of the case. Well, the fact is, I had no clue until I read up on it prior to writing this. It appears nothing would happen for a long time. The feds had some suspects, but nobody was talking. Then, just after the new millennium began, they got the witnesses they needed. A slew of gangsters involved were convicted and will likely die in prison. The family who owned the farm, I have no clue what became of them. The job was great, and they treated me really well. But that's, for me, where it all ends. Behind closed doors, they were into some really crooked stuff. Stuff that I didn't want to be roped into. I'm just a simple fella, and my life has been great since then. I don't regret leaving that place for 1 second. This all happened very recently. I'm a young woman who works late nights at a bar in a city, but I live in a very rural area just outside of town. It was a very slow night, so we closed early, and one of the bouncers walked me to my car. I didn't particularly notice anybody following me while I was on the main roads. Just a normal sprinkling of cars. I first noticed them when they turned onto one of the super small roads that leads toward the area where I live. It was strange, because people rarely pull off onto that road, at the same time as me even, and it isn't very populated. But as soon as we were on the winding and unlit road, they began to behave strangely. They'd flash their brights at me, they'd ride my butt until they were practically scraping my bumper, then pull really far back. I tried speeding up and slowing down, but that didn't seem to matter. When we first came to the first intersection, they turned on their signal to go right, but when I went straight, I watched them in my mirror closely, turn the nose of their car to the right, pause for a few seconds, then follow me straight. This continued for a while. At the next intersection, I signaled left and waited until they did too, then quickly turned right, and of course they followed. I then called the cops and told them I was headed towards a gas station I knew to be open, and was the only place remotely nearby that might have people at it, since almost nothing is 24 hours right now. They said they dispatched police to meet me there, and I tried to focus on driving slowly, so I didn't beat them there. When I got to the gas station, I pulled into the little turn lane, which made the car pause, and then quickly step on the gas and squeal around the corner. I only really had time to glimpse the general look of the car and the driver's face. They were alone, and very strange looking. Incredibly pale, albino pale, with equally pale hair. They were completely androgynous, at least from what I could see, and they stared at me for a second before bolting. The police took like 20 minutes to arrive after that, so I just sat in front of the gas station and watched the road for cars with my doors locked. The police said, of course, there wasn't anything they could do. My original assumption was that it was a patron from work. But we'd had so few customers, I feel like I would have recognized them. I don't even know why they would have followed me for a full hour, only to begin making themselves obvious. If you have any words of advice, it would be greatly appreciated.